History as It Happens, November 9th, 2023. Why Peace Failed.
This brave gamble that the future can be better than the past must endure.
Yesterday, a dream. Today, a commitment. The Israeli and the Palestinian peoples, who fought each other for almost a century, have agreed to move decisively on the path of dialogue, understanding, and cooperation.
Truly shocking news from the Middle East tonight. Israel's Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin has been assassinated.
The cycle of violence began after Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon visited the Temple Mount in Jerusalem.
After 14 days of intensive negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, I have concluded with regret that they will not be able to reach an agreement at this time.
30 years since the Oslo Accords, 23 years after the Camp David summit, but they seem like ancient history. Today, Israelis and Palestinians are still killing each other over the same fundamental issues that were almost resolved a generation ago. They concern who gets to live where in a sliver of Holy Land on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. Why did the Oslo Accords fail? And can the two-state solution be brought back? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
There's no going back to the status quo as it stood on October the 6th. That means ensuring Hamas can no longer terrorize Israel and use Palestinian civilians as human shields. It also means that when this crisis is over, there has to be a vision of what comes next. And in our view, it has to be a two-state solution.
I don't think it was inevitable that the process had to fail. I do think that there was a window of opportunity, not at Camp David, but after Camp David, in the fall and winter of 2000 and the first weeks of 2001. There was a window there, and it did look like the two sides were very close.
Peace is possible when both sides realize that violence, vengeance, rejectionism, stubbornness, pride, finger-pointing will never solve their dispute. The essence of war is violence, but wars usually don't solve problems. The folly of war can convince people, usually after years if not decades of death and destruction, that a new approach is necessary. This helps explain why in the winter and spring of 1993, Israeli and Palestinian officials met in secret outside Oslo, Norway, outside normal diplomatic channels, and reached a stunning agreement, mutual recognition between Israel and the PLO, and the foundation for Palestinian autonomy in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The brand new Clinton administration had little to do with this, but it would take on a major role in trying to get Arabs and Jews to implement what became known as the Oslo Accords. In September 1993, a signing ceremony took place on the White House lawn that, from our vantage point today, seems impossible. An American president, flanked by an Israeli prime minister and Palestinian leader.
Then, as now,
Yitzhak Rabin had been elected prime minister the prior year on a modest peace platform. And in his remarks, he made clear how difficult it would be to pursue peace after so much blood had been spilled.
This signing of the Israeli-Palestinian Declaration of Principle here today, it's not so easy. Neither for myself, as a soldier in Israel's war, nor for the people of Israel, not to the Jewish people in the diaspora who are watching us now with great hope mixed with apprehension. It is certainly not easy for the families of the victims of the wars, violence, terror, whose pain will never heal. We who have seen our relatives and friends killed before our eyes, we who have attended their funerals and cannot look into the eyes of their parents, we who have come from a land where parents buried their children, we who have fought against you, the Palestinians, we say to you today, in a loud and a clear voice, enough of blood and tears. Enough.
Over the next several years and additional interim agreements, just how close Israel and the PLO came to ending their long war is open to debate, as is who is to blame for the demise of the Oslo Accords. Opponents of peace used violence to derail negotiations. For instance, Hamas suicide bombers killed Israeli civilians, and a Jewish religious student named Yigal Amir assassinated Rabin in November 1995. And then in September 2000, riots erupted when Likud party leader Ariel Sharon visited the Temple Mount. And the violence escalated into the Second Intifada.
I think, obviously, a big part of what's driving these demonstrations is a profound alienation of young people in the Palestinian community who have not seen any economic benefits from peace over the last 8 years and who despair that it will ever actually be completed.
The two-state solution has lingered as a memory, not a real possibility in recent years. But this new outbreak of devastating violence might bring it back. At least that's what President Biden and Secretary of State Antony Blinken are saying needs to happen once Israel's destruction of Gaza ends.
There's no going back to the status quo as it stood on October the 6th. That means ensuring Hamas can no longer terrorize Israel and use Palestinian civilians as human shields. It also means that when this crisis is over, there has to be a vision of what comes next. And in our view, it has to be a two-state solution.
We will be talking about how we can set the conditions for a durable, sustainable peace, durable, sustainable security for Israelis and Palestinians alike. We're focused on the day of. We also need to be focused on the day after.
The problems standing in the way of a two-state solution today are pretty much the same as they were in 1993, only with 30 years of developments and complications piled on. As I often say, this isn't history, it's very much the present. The subject may be old, but the issue is fresh. Khaled Elgindy is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, where he directs the program on Palestine and Israeli-Palestinian affairs. He is the author of Blind Spot, America and the Palestinians, from Balfour to Trump. He is a scholar and was a participant in the peace process, having served as an advisor to the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah on permanent status negotiations with Israel from 2004 to 2009, among other negotiations. Khaled Elgindy, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get to the history and the demise of the two-state solution, just want your general thoughts on what's happening right now in Gaza. As we record this episode, already an estimated 10,000 Palestinians have been killed, mostly civilians, women and children. Do you agree that it looks like this is going to be a long campaign and the outcome is unclear?
Well, it certainly looks that way right now. The outcome is very unclear, in large part because we don't know what Israel's end game is. We know what they've stated as their end game, which is the total destruction of Hamas. No one is entirely clear on what that means. I'm not sure even the Israelis understand fully what that entails. It's probably an unachievable goal. And so that would suggest, absent any major intervention by outside actors, namely the United States, then we are likely to see a very long, drawn-out, very, very bloody conflict.
If Israel is able to militarily defeat or devastate Hamas to the point where the organization is defunct, if you will, that raises the question of what will come after that. An occupying force, some kind of international or Arab force in Gaza, the Palestinian Authority, the Fatah movement, would they take over? I mean, they're very unpopular, obviously, within the Palestinian community. I mean, any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I as I said, I don't think the goal of completely annihilating Hamas can be achieved because Hamas is a political movement. And even if the entire leadership is destroyed, there will be others that will emerge. You can't really kill an idea or an ideology as long as there's an occupation and a blockade and a reason for there to be an armed resistance. There will be Hamas or something like Hamas. So that said, Israel can obviously destroy Hamas's military capabilities and its capability of governing. There will necessarily be a vacuum. And I'm not sure the Israelis have given a lot of thought to what will fill that vacuum. They are single-mindedly focused on destroying Hamas and also large chunks of Gaza's civilian infrastructure. Only right now are American and other powers starting to think about what will fill the vacuum. And no one has any clear answers. The notion that the Palestinian Authority will return, that's always been on the table. That was kind of the ideal scenario, that the PA would return to Gaza, but it's unlikely to do that on the backs of Israeli tanks. As you said, its popularity, its legitimacy among Palestinians is at an all-time low. That has been compounded by this crisis where the leadership of Mahmoud Abbas and his Fatah party are seen as completely irrelevant in the calamity that is befalling Palestinians in Gaza. So there's real deep anger toward the Palestinian Authority. So they already have that disadvantage. But to expect them to come in right after Israel has inflicted thousands and thousands of casualties will cement the perception among Palestinians that they are just a quisling government of collaborationists and not a truly representative governing body.
Yeah, kind of de facto security arm of the occupying power in the West Bank.
To extend that now to Gaza on the graves of thousands of Palestinians, I think would destroy whatever shreds of credibility they might have left.
And I agree with you about destroying an idea or an ideology or a theology. It's really not possible. I often remind listeners, based on my recent conversations, that Hamas rose out of the first intifada in the late 1980s, and that the intifada came from resistance to the Israeli occupation, the occupation policies that had angered so many Palestinians, the ongoing injustice of that year after year after year. I mean, that's how we have Hamas today. Obviously, Israel facilitated the rise of Hamas during those years. What are your thoughts on this idea that the two-state solution is getting a new hearing?
More people are talking about a two-state solution now than were before. For the most part, it remains a talking point. There is a realization on the part of the Biden administration in particular that there will need to be some sort of political horizon coming out of this horror show in Gaza, and that we can't simply destroy Gaza, destroy so many lives, and then go back to the way things were without any hope for the future. Because part of what brought this sequence of events on was the fact that there was no hope, that Palestinians were feeling more and more desperation and despair, and the world had sort of moved on and forgotten about them while they were continuing to suffer under a punishing blockade in Gaza and ongoing violence in the West Bank and the loss of their land and homes and so forth. So there's a realization that we can't go back to that there needs to be some hope. But the idea that somehow the conditions for negotiating a two-state solution will be better after Gaza's destruction is a little bit far-fetched. I mean, if anything, the current Israeli government, which is already the most extreme in Israel's history and is committed to dismantling the very idea of a Palestinian state or even a Palestinian nation, they're not going to be in the mood to negotiate anything. So I think this war is going to harden positions on all sides and make that goal much, much harder to achieve.
You led right into my next question, and that was it's going to take new leadership on both sides. Hamas rejects all negotiation over the land. The Palestinian Authority, as we've discussed, discredited. The Israeli right is not interested in a two-state solution. Netanyahu has not been interested in a two-state solution. And what kind of state would the Palestinians even get at this point? But do you agree that it would require fresh leadership on both sides? And it's really hard to see who that would be at this point.
It's fair to say that any diplomatic process, any political progress between Israelis and Palestinians would require a very different leadership on both sides. I mean, the Palestinians would need a more credible, effective leadership that is also coherent instead of this divided, dysfunctional leadership that they've had, one authority in the West Bank and a parallel authority in Gaza, each of them working at cross purposes with one another in terms of the goals of the national movement. So you need to have a single coherent political leadership on the Palestinian side that was credible and seen as legitimate by its people. And then on the Israeli side, of course, you would need to have a leadership that was not only representative, but also inclined to peace. Right now, Israel has no incentive to move in that direction because a Palestinian state requires very difficult decisions. The evacuation of tens of thousands of Israeli settlers from what many Israelis see as the biblical heartland of the Jewish people, that's not an easy thing to do, in addition to things like dividing Jerusalem so that you would have a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem and an Israeli capital in West Jerusalem. That's another very tall order. Right now, there aren't any political forces in Israel that I can see that are willing to take those steps.
These issues go back to the beginning, 1947-48, when the UN voted to partition the land into an Arab state and a Jewish state. The issue of Jerusalem was there. Have it under an international condominium until some lasting resolution could be arrived at. The years change and the names change, but these fundamental issues stay the same. And it's been my position, and I'm certainly no expert on this, that this is fundamentally a war over land.
It's true that this is a conflict over competing national claims by two distinct national groups over the same piece of territory, of the same land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. People will call it Greater Israel or historic Palestine, depending on which side of the issue they're on. That is essentially what is at stake. Since 1947, a lot has happened. The conflict has many dimensions, one of which is during Israel's creation in 1948, the majority of Palestine's Arab population was forced out of the country. In some cases at gunpoint, in other cases they fled out of fear, hoping, like many people, hoping to return to their homes after the fighting had stopped. They remain outside to this day. And so the Palestinian refugee problem is one of the original sins of the Israel-Palestine conflict that has never been seriously addressed. And it's not a coincidence that Gaza's population is made up primarily of about 70% or so are refugees from 1948 who fled lands in what is now Israel. Yep. In addition to the other dimension of the conflict, which is the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip after 1967. And so both of those issues, the dispossession of Palestinians and the continued occupation and military rule over the remainder of the Palestinian population, are really at the core of this conflict today.
So jog your memory for me. In 1993, do you remember how you felt when you heard or learned that in secret Palestinian and Israeli negotiators were meeting, I guess it was in Norway, to discuss the parameters of a two-state solution, and they made a major breakthrough. At least it was major at the time.
I do remember that moment, actually. I remember because I was on a plane headed back from the region to the United States after having spent the summer in the West Bank as a grad student. And I think, like a lot of people, I was surprised. I was a little bit skeptical, but still cautiously optimistic. People forget what an optimistic moment that was after the signing of the Oslo Accords in September 1993.
Ever since Harry Truman first recognized Israel, every American president, Democrat and Republican, has worked for peace between Israel and her neighbors. Now the efforts of all who have labored before us bring us to this moment, a moment when we dare to pledge what for so long seemed difficult even to imagine, that the security of the Israeli people will be reconciled with the hopes of the Palestinian people, and there will be more security and more hope for all.
There was this sense of euphoria almost among Israelis and Palestinians that maybe a solution was finally at hand, that this 100-year conflict could finally be ended. And I think no one was under any illusions that it was going to be easy, but at least now there seemed the possibility. And for for a lot of people like me, we were thinking, a Palestinian state is right around the corner. Within 5, 6, 7 years, probably, we'll see an independent Palestinian state come out of this Oslo process, which, of course, didn't happen.
Yeah, it was supposed to take about 5 years, an interim period before there was going to be a final agreement. But, there's one parallel here. Maybe it doesn't work. At the time of the Oslo process, both sides realized that they needed something new. They needed to try something new because this is coming after the first Intifada. And on the Palestinian side, the PLO leadership at the time, which had been in exile, Arafat was in Tunisia, realized that their years of rejectionist and maximalist demands did not work, did not have a Palestinian state. Arafat was also pretty desperate at the time. The PLO's financial base and popular support were on the wane, and they were actually losing popularity to this group called Hamas at that point. So can you address what the Palestinian leadership was thinking at the time and whether this parallel has any use for us today?
Yeah, just to clarify, the
sure.
PLO did not have a maximalist stance in 1993. The PLO recognized Israel in 1988 and, in fact, had been pushing to enter the peace process for many, many years under the auspices of the United States, and had to jump through a number of hoops in order to do that, one of which was having to recognize Israel's right to exist and renounce violence.
So they did that prior to the 1991 Madrid conference. Then.
Right, yeah. And so it had come to that conclusion early on, but hadn't really been able to meet the conditions formally until 1988. That was a process that I think was facilitated by the Palestinian uprising at the time. That first Intifada was very empowering for people on the ground, that they could sustain this mass mobilization of general strikes and mostly nonviolent forms of resistance for several years at great cost. The Israeli military regime was quite oppressive throughout that period. As far as the PLO's calculus, it was the Intifada on one hand had opened up space. It had put the Palestinian issue on the international agenda in ways that it had never been, or at least not in many decades. So for the PLO, it was an opportunity, but it was also a challenge. Because, as you said, there were new forces on the ground in the occupied territories that were coming to the fore. There was something called the unified leadership of the uprising, really a grassroots leadership representing all of the main factions that were part of the PLO. And this was at a time when the PLO and all of its constituent groups, like Fatah and the PFLP and others, were entirely banned by Israel. But they had an underground leadership that managed to launch and sustain this uprising. At the same time, there was also Hamas, as you said, had come into existence in around the same time period. So now there were challenges to the PLO's preeminence as the sole representative of Palestinians and as the main political address for the national movement. And so that was another incentive for the PLO to want to territorialize, to want to return from exile to the occupied territories, to govern and to lead. The Oslo process presented that opportunity as a step toward building their future state.
And on the Israeli side, there was an election in 1992. I know you'll correct me if I get my dates or names wrong here. Yitzhak Shamir, the Likud party, they lose to Rabin. Now, Rabin was no dove. He had been the defense minister and crushed the Intifada. But there was a peace faction, if you will, or a realization on the Israeli side that years of occupation and using violence to crush the Intifada, this was not sustainable, and we need to find a fundamental solution to the problem of the Palestinians.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, there was a realization, there was kind of a critical mass within the Israeli leadership. Israel had to come to terms with the Palestinian national movement, that they could not simply write them off as terrorists and as non-partners and trying to bypass them by dealing directly with Arab states or others. And so that was an important realization. That was one of the successes of the Intifada. Even someone as battle-hardened as Yitzhak Rabin had come to that conclusion, even though he, as you said, was not a dove, and he was not particularly open to the idea of a Palestinian state, but he did understand the costs of continuing to rule over a population that was hostile because they were not citizens, they had no basic rights, and that would have to change. So there was a convergence of interests on both sides that it allowed the Oslo Agreement to happen.
You said there how there was a realization on the Israeli side they couldn't just write off the Palestinian problem and just pretend that it didn't exist. I mean, that is what Netanyahu is being criticized for today. And also the United States for the Abraham Accords. But when it comes to successive Israeli governments, not just Netanyahu, this modus vivendi they had reached with Hamas since, I guess, 2007, 2008? We just mow the grass every once in a while, which is their way of saying we have to go into Gaza every few years and deal with this or that outbreak, right? But then we'll just go back to this status quo where Hamas won't strike us and we'll leave them alone. You know what I'm saying.
It was a very difficult status quo. It was quite painful, particularly for the Palestinians. Gaza was under a blockade since 2007. Sometimes would get loosened, usually as a result of violence. So there'd be an outbreak of violence, and then new terms for a ceasefire would be agreed to. That might include things like more trucks of goods coming in and out of Gaza. Because, under a blockade, you can't control your economy, right? You can't export freely. And so it had this suffocating impact on the Palestinian economy in Gaza and in humanitarian terms. So every now and again, there would be outbreaks of violence, and Israel would resort to what they refer to as mowing the grass, sort of implying what was quite dehumanizing, but also implying that a certain amount of violence was expected and that it was acceptable because every now and again they would just go in and restore their quote unquote deterrent by increasing the costs for that violence. And in the process, folks in Gaza would get some restrictions, some loosening of the restrictions on imports and exports, maybe some work permits for Gazan laborers to work in Israel, expanding the fishing zone, that sort of thing. And then we'd go back to the way things were until the next outbreak. And that is precisely the very painful status quo that Hamas was looking to shatter once and for all.
So Oslo won. The Declaration of Principles on Palestinian Self-Rule, referred to as Oslo 1, had a 5-year program in there for an interim Palestinian autonomy in the occupied territory, so not quite a state. What else did Oslo 1 entail, and why was it important?
Well, Oslo introduced the idea of Palestinian self-governance or autonomy, which for Palestinians was supposed to be a step toward full sovereignty and statehood. For the Israeli side, it might have been, I think it was something less than that. Rabin himself, as we said, never came around to the idea of an independent Palestinian state, even though others, like Shimon Peres, his foreign minister, were in favor of a Palestinian state. And then we've seen since then various leaders from the left, center, and right who had different views. The Israeli view tended to be kind of a state minus or autonomy plus. And I remember being in the Annapolis negotiations during that year in 2008, and we were in meetings with Tzipi Livni, who was then the foreign minister and one of their lead negotiators, or I think she was justice minister. Anyway, I don't remember exactly, but she was in charge of the negotiations on the Israeli side. And she said, you can call it a state, you can call it sovereignty, but Israel will have to have a presence on the Jordan Valley between the state of Palestine and Jordan. There can be no other army in the territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. The Israeli vision was always something less than full sovereignty. And that was one of the problems with the process. There were two very different understandings of what a two-state solution should look like and mean.
And the army presence is what? Military necessity? Was that the reason for it?
Yeah, that only the Israeli army, they would not trust even a third party or international force to provide security for Israel, that only Israeli armed forces could protect Israelis. And that was the underlying philosophy that most Israeli governments were kind of unbudging on.
So no surprise that there was intense opposition to Oslo I. As soon as you start getting into the details and then who gets what and how do we arrive at these resolutions, that's when people start to bicker or dispute or whatever. But then we get Oslo II. A couple years later, this was a much more specific document described as having excruciating detail by William Cleveland in his book, A History of the Modern Middle East, that I'm holding here. I've used this book quite a bit lately as a guide to my preparation. Oslo II was a 350-page document, detailed the stages of Israeli military redeployment in the West Bank, the process by which power would be transferred to Palestinian civil authority, and several other long and short-term matters. Maybe the most controversial of all, though, was the map. Area A, 3% of the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority would have direct control of that, 3%. And it would have some municipal functions and share control with Israel in Area B, 24% of the West Bank. And then Israel would retain total control of Area C, which made up 74% of the West Bank and included 145 settlements in that territory.
Right.
So what was the problem with this?
Well, the problem with that was, again, going back to the differing expectations of the two sides. For the Palestinian side, that was a starting point, right? The 3% Area A, 24% Area B, with the expectation that over time, gradually Israel would hand over more and more land to be put under control of the PA until you get to that point where all that's left are the settlements. And then you decide that in these permanent status negotiations. And that was indeed what was supposed to happen. There were supposed to be 3 different redeployments after Oslo. The first one was the Israeli army deployed from Gaza and Jericho in the West Bank. And then in the second phase, a greater percentage. The process got held up on that third redeployment, in which Palestinians hoped the bulk of the West Bank territory would be handed over. But the process got frozen. And so Area A at its maximum only reached, I think, 19%, and Area B was like another 20% or another 19% or so. So about 39, 40% of the West Bank by 1998 was Area A or B, where there was any Palestinian governing presence, whereas the bulk, Area C, remained under Israeli control. That is more than 60% of the West Bank. And I should add, East Jerusalem was not part of that equation. So there was no redeployment planned for East Jerusalem, which is ultimately where Palestinians hope to have their capital. So the process just got frozen, and it's been in that same place since 1998.
Arafat has been criticized for walking away from what you just described as a statelet or, at least a piece of the West Bank. Do you share that criticism? And this was in 2000 in the Camp David talks. By this point, Ehud Barak is the Israeli prime minister.
So in 2000, there was this new push by President Clinton, who was in the waning months of his second term and had big dreams of maybe clinching his legacy as a great peacemaker and resolving the 100-year Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so he put together this high-stakes summit at Camp David in the summer of 2000. The Palestinians were very reluctant to go. They felt we're not ready. We haven't worked out all of the details and managing expectations. And his big fear was that if the project went south, that it would be him and the Palestinians who got blamed. He got assurances from both Secretary Albright and President Clinton that the United States would not blame the Palestinians if the process failed. And so he went on that basis. And when the process did fail, because what the Israelis had put on offer was what Ehud Barak in particular had put on offer was certainly far-reaching compared to anything any previous Israeli had been willing to propose. But it fell short of the minimal Palestinian demands of sovereignty. So, for example, it was a proposed state made up of 3 different cantons in the West Bank that would be connected artificially through bridges and tunnels, with the Jordan Valley remaining under Israeli control, with no Palestinian sovereignty in East Jerusalem. So all three of these were deal breakers for the Palestinian side. And so the Palestinians couldn't accept it. The summit collapsed. And what happened afterwards was, despite the president's promise not to blame the Palestinians, he did blame them. And because, time was running short and he hoped to clinch a deal while he was still in office. But then negotiations continued for the remainder of Clinton's time in office. So from July of 2000 until January 2001, negotiations continued, and they actually got very, very close to clinching a deal. But the problem was, in the midst of that process, the Palestinian second intifada had broken out in September.
And that was triggered by Sharon's visit to, well, I'll let you explain. There was a precipitating cause there.
Ariel Sharon was the right-wing opposition leader to Ehud Barak at the time, and who was vying for his job as prime minister. And he saw what took place at Camp David. And like a lot of Israelis believed that Ehud Barak was planning to make these unacceptable compromises in places like Jerusalem. And so he decided to make a bold visit to the center of Jerusalem, really the most contested site in Jerusalem, which is the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. For Jews is considered the Temple Mount and the holiest place for Jews, and the third holiest place for Muslims. So this is really where kind of the epicenter of the conflict, right in the heart of Jerusalem. So he decided to make this bold visit to that site, which stirred protests, and Israeli forces who were accompanying Ariel Sharon shot and killed a number of Palestinian protesters. And then that was the match that sparked a wave of protests across the occupied territories that then turned into the second intifada.
Because anger and disenchantment had been building for years. I mentioned Barak. Ehud Barak was the prime minister. I didn't mention that in 1996, Netanyahu wins the Israeli elections. Rabin had been assassinated by a fanatical Jewish religious student who was unhappy with any conciliatory moves toward Muslims. Hamas during these years was doing suicide bombings in Israel, and ordinary Israeli citizens are saying, what is this here? We're trying to, reach some kind of accommodation, and we're thanked with suicide bombers. So you had a lot going on during this time. And also the Palestinian Authority, or the PLO under Arafat, he's being told by the Americans, do something about Hamas, and he doesn't really have all that much power to stop what is going on there, does he?
Right. So during the Oslo years, there is violent opposition on both sides. There are violent Israeli settlers and extremists who carry out violence against Palestinians, like the Hebron massacre in 1994, and also, of course, the extremist Israeli who murdered the Israeli prime minister in November 1995. Hamas is doing its part to derail the Oslo process through violence, as you said, through suicide bombings, and at the same time capitalizing on the failure of the process. So every time there's a missed deadline or, some agreement that isn't fulfilled, then Hamas can point to it and say, see, the peace process is a sham. The only way to achieve liberation is through violence, and we're going to be the vanguards of that violence. It did put Arafat in this difficult position because he had to crack down on that violence. He was expected to crack down by the Americans and by the Israelis. But at the same time, Hamas is growing in popularity because of the failures of Oslo. And so it's a mutually reinforcing kind of cycle where the failure of the peace process strengthens Hamas, which then weakens Arafat, and then the cycle continues. And then Israelis have less incentive to move forward on its obligations because of the violence. And so it just, like I said, mutually reinforcing.
Those who are advocating for a peaceful solution to this find themselves, shunted aside. The extremists in a situation like this gain ground, and the sane middle becomes smaller and smaller. So we've gotten to the gist of why the Oslo Accords did not work out. In retrospect, what a missed opportunity. It seems so difficult. Maybe it was unrealistic to expect all that progress to be made in such a short period of time, given the nature of the issues. But again, in retrospect, looking back on it, it's the best chance we had here And now we're what, 23, 24 years after the fact, if you date it from the Camp David failure.
I don't think it was inevitable that the process had to fail. I do think that there was a window of opportunity, not at Camp David, but after Camp David in the fall and winter of 2000 and the first weeks of 2001. There was a window there, and it did look like the two sides were very close. You know, Clinton had put forward a set of parameters that took into account, that went beyond whatever was proposed at Camp David, took into account the basic demands and needs of the two sides, but without fleshing it out in detail, and just put forward a series of points. And both sides, both leaderships, had essentially accepted the Clinton parameters with reservations. And there are a couple of important statements made by the White House in January of 2001 to that effect, that both sides have accepted the Clinton parameters with reservations, and then there was hope that those gaps could be bridged in the 2 or 3 weeks left in Clinton's term. But it didn't happen, in large part because of factors outside of the negotiating room. On the one hand, there was the violence of the Second Intifada, which had become militarized at that point. There were now gun battles between armed rebels on the Palestinian side fighting Israeli soldiers and attacking also Israeli settlers. And we also saw the reintroduction of suicide bombings. There was this growing death toll on the two sides, most of it on the Palestinian side because of the asymmetry of the two sides, but enough Israeli casualties that it was hardening positions and emboldening Barak's opposition, Ariel Sharon. So Ariel Sharon, by January 2001, looked like he was guaranteed to defeat Ehud Barak in elections the following month in February. There were the domestic political factors and constraints on both sides, and ultimately the process just didn't come to fruition. Neither side could really openly and unreservedly embrace that deal in the little time that was left. And so it was a lost opportunity. And I will just say, I don't think, from my analysis is no other process has come close to resolving the conflict as that time period between July and January of 2001. The parties came closer to reaching a conflict-ending deal in that time than at any previous time or any time since then. So if there was going to be a two-state solution deal struck, it would have been in that moment. And I don't think it was inevitable that it had to fail. But one of the reasons it did fail is because the role that the United States played by essentially putting its thumb on the scale, doing things like, even though they promised not to blame the Palestinian side, that's precisely what they did. They blamed the Palestinians for rejecting the Camp David offer, and then they blamed them again for the violence that erupted after September with the outbreak of the Intifada.
So I recall after the failure of the Camp David talks. Actually, I don't remember this myself. I've since listened to the speech online. Bill Clinton came out of the talks and spoke to reporters.
Israelis and Palestinians are destined to live side by side, destined to have a common future. They have to decide what kind of future it will be. Though the differences that remain are deep, they have come a long way in the last 7 years. And notwithstanding the failure to reach an agreement, they made real headway in the last 2 weeks. Now the two parties must go home and reflect, both on what happened at Camp David and on what did not happen. For the sake of their children, they must rededicate themselves to the path of peace.
Well, fast forward to today. On the West Bank, we have a much larger Jewish settlement presence now than there was in 2000 when we were talking about those fractions, 3%, 24%, 75%. What kind of state would the Palestinians have on the West Bank, given what Netanyahu calls facts on the ground or demographic changes on the ground?
Right. That's precisely one of the key factors that torpedoed the Oslo process. Is all throughout the United States basically allowed Israel to continue expanding settlements. It completely undermined the goal of Palestinian statehood You can't negotiate over a pie while the other side is eating it. That became the number one Palestinian grievance. And there was really never any let up in the settlement project, such that in 2000, there were maybe 200,000 or so, 220,000 or so Israeli settlers in the occupied territories. And fast forward to today, you have more than 700,000. In a few years, we'll hit 1 million Israeli settlers, which the whole goal of the settlement enterprise is to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state, to prevent any kind of Palestinian territorial contiguity. And so for the peace process to allow it, to tolerate a settlement expansion was directly undermining its mission of a two-state solution.
So Rabin, even under Rabin, the freeze on settlements was lifted.
Right. And freeze was a loose term. They always talked about restraint or scaling back or a pause, but an outright settlement freeze, which is something that, for example, the Roadmap Peace Plan in 2003, the international plan backed by the United States, Europe, Russia, and the United Nations, called for a complete settlement freeze. But it was never implemented and was basically discarded by the Bush administration. So it's, of course, impossible to build a state that isn't contiguous and which Palestinians don't control their own resources and borders and airspace and so on. The Israeli side has not yet fully come to terms with the idea of Palestinian sovereignty and all that would entail, which means full control. Israeli proposals have been repackaging the occupation in one form or another, perpetuating Israeli control. I mean, look at the Gaza disengagement. In 2005, Israel left the Gaza Strip, but it didn't just simply leave. It left and then locked the keys, locked the doors behind it so that Gaza became closed. Movement in and out of goods and people in and out of Gaza was restricted. Gaza was not a free area. It was still under Israeli control, but from the outside. And that is this similar vision to what Israelis have proposed for a future Palestinian state, independent in name only, but still largely under Israel's control.
And as for Hamas, they obviously don't believe in a Jewish state. The Palestinian Authority, we've already gone over their problem. So I can't see any positive short-term outcome here, and that is it's truly tragic.
It is. And I think this is where it's really important to have a unified, cohesive Palestinian leadership, because from the standpoint of Palestinians, both of these projects have failed. Hamas has failed to liberate Palestine through violence. The other leadership of Mahmoud Abbas and the Fatah Party, they have also failed to bring about in Palestinian freedom and independence through diplomacy and negotiations. And therein lies the fundamental problem. If the diplomatic process won't succeed, then you leave openings for violence. And that's where we are.
At the end of this summit, I am fully aware of the deep disappointment that will be felt on both sides. But it was essential for Israelis and Palestinians finally to begin to deal with the toughest decisions in the peace process. Only they can make those decisions, and they both pledged to make them, I say again, by mid-September. Now it's essential that they not lose hope, that they keep working for peace, they avoid any unilateral actions that would only make the hard task ahead more difficult. The statement the leaders that have made today is encouraging in that regard. Israelis and Palestinians are destined to live side by side, destined to have a common future. They have to decide what kind of future it will be. The children of Abraham, the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael, can only be reconciled through courageous compromise.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, we'll be joined by Andrew Roberts, eminent historian, to discuss his new book, co-written with General David Petraeus, about the history of warfare and how conflict has changed. We're going to discuss my argument that there are no military solutions to the political problem of the Israelis and the Palestinians. We'll also discuss urban warfare in 2023. That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.